Behold, my glorious supporter, Flipz, has requested some discussion about why Warframe Affinity Range exists. That might seem like a weird question. I don't think it is. Flipz says, why does Affinity Range exist in Warframe, design-wise? Does it provide a meaningful improvement to the gameplay of Warframe? And if so, what does that say about the universal Affinity Range and shared loot pickup in Railjack missions? I'm not sure if there's any equivalent to Affinity Range in other games you play, but if so, a wider discussion of the subject that's not necessarily limited to Warframe specifically would also be interesting. Yeah, I think we can figure that out. First of all, for those unfamiliar, what is Affinity Range? It's this mechanic in Warframe where if you are not close enough to fellow teammates and they gain affinity experience in Warframe, you don't get it. In Warframe, having teammates around doesn't make you share experience, but you all just get a copy of it. If you and I are next to each other and I kill an enemy, we both just get the same experience. So you are generally better off having teammates because they will usually kill things within affinity range, and then you both get the experience, meaning that at worst, they just help you kill the same number of enemies, or in many missions, there are just more enemies if you have more teammates. So you will probably get much more affinity if you play on public in a group of 4 people. It is almost always inferior to do anything in Warframe not on public, and that's one big reason why, among several others. However, it is possible that teammates will be very spread out. The most common type of mission where this is a problem rather than just we'll talk about it as a design choice, is survival missions, where there is a huge map and there isn't really any particular reason that you would stay together except for affinity sharing range. And so it's quite possible that enemies will spawn near your various teammates between whom it is impossible to be within affinity range of all of them, and then you'll just lose some experience you might have otherwise gotten, I guess. So there is a reason to ask, why have this mechanic? Why not just share it everywhere? And there is a mission type in Warframe, Railjack missions, that do share affinity everywhere. So why? Why not? What all that stuff? Well, the first answer, I think, is that it encourages you to play. You have to stay near each other. If you AFK, then you will probably not remain in affinity radius. Now, if you play a defense mission, you probably will. But indeed, in defense missions, it actually does cover most of the map. But in survival missions and such, you definitely won't stay in affinity range of allies if you stay still, because they probably won't stay still. And they'll move around and you'll be outside of it. But I'm not really sure that that's a compelling answer. I think a lot of people are going to be quick to say it's to prevent people from AFKing, which is why I said that 3 minutes into this video. But I don't think that that is a compelling reason, and I'm not convinced that's actually why it's done, although I do think it's worth briefly discussing that point. You might ask, well, if people want to AFK in the game, doesn't that just mean the game isn't fun? I don't know. I have had that thought. If there's a need to prevent players from AFKing, doesn't that mean the game is just boring? No, I don't think so, because players will optimize the fun out of anything if given the chance. And what happens is you like a game, but the game has things you can gain, experience, loot, what have you, and you realize, I could just not play and still get those things. So why am I putting effort into this, And the fact that you kind of need to for some kind of system reason can be enough of an excuse to just stop worrying about that. Don't think about that, That's a common explanation. But if you think about it in Warframe, I'm not really sure that it accomplishes that very often. In different kinds of Warframe missions, it's either not likely you will be outside of affinity range ever, defense missions, or it's impossible to be in affinity range ever, survival missions. I mean, it's not impossible, but you get the point. So does it really fix it? You know what I mean? You're really not that much worse off if you AFK in a survival mission, and you're not better off if you move around in a defense mission. So I'm not really sure that's why. Now, I know a lot of people might say, well, that's not why. I don't think that's why. But yeah, I mean, I think that mechanically rewarding you for being near your allies just gives you more of a squad feeling. I think that's kind of why. The feeling like you benefit from things when you're near each other feels kind of reasonable. It feels like things that have something to do with you are things that benefit you. From a thematic perspective, a lot of games have something like an experience share radius or a loot sharing radius or something. And a big reason for those things is that it kind of makes intuitive sense. Why do you benefit so much from events that happen when you are nowhere nearby? That just like why, you know what I mean? So I'm not completely convinced that that is a good reason. Now for Railjack, you said why is there universal affinity in Railjack? If there's a good reason for there to be a limited affinity sharing radius, then why is there a mission type in Warframe where there isn't a limited affinity sharing radius? Well, because Railjack as a game mode is designed around you basically never being within range of each other. Railjack missions often heavily reward you for dividing and conquering, and so it wouldn't make any sense for you to be rewarded for staying together when most of the point of most Railjack mission types is that at least that sometimes you spread out or you benefit from spreading out. And I think for what it's worth, I think that's a fun thing about Railjack. And it maybe does it fairly well from time to time. So it's a place where they said, yeah, I mean, mechanically, it just doesn't work. So never mind what other benefits it provides. Let's just get rid of it. But I do think that's a good, premise to think about. Yeah, in survival missions and such, doesn't it also not make sense? If surviving can sometimes mean running away from the enemies temporarily, yeah, I mean, why can't you just have affinity there? I don't know. Like I am pretty much sold, Flipz, that affinity range in Warframe is like sort of not that important, but I'm not convinced there's no other benefit. It's an interesting subject. I feel like it's worthy of discussion that a lot of other games that do this, the range is maybe shorter because the game cares more about that immersion feeling. World of Warcraft is a good example. You can't necessarily gain loot and stuff from like really far away, at least in my memory. I played World of Warcraft like 10 years ago. A lot longer than 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Anyway, a long time ago. But in my memory, you had to be kind of close. Maybe it's actually less far away than in Warframe, but it felt close. And World of Warcraft is a game that I think is more interested in your character gains experience because you had an experience. Whereas in Warframe, it's just kind of a mechanic that's there. It's in other games. I don't think there's anything like wrong per se with leveling stuff up in Warframe. But I don't think it's as much of a focus for the game, if you know what I mean. And I think that's another point. Leveling things up, just in general, period, is kind of I sort of feel like meaningless problem in games like Warframe to some extent, that only really serves to pad out the runtime of the experience. Now, a lot of players really like leveling up. And there are a few reasons for this. They might like it because the feeling of progression is meaningful to them. Now, I would argue you can get progression many other ways, by building items, by mastery in Warframe is a way some people find that satisfying, and that doesn't have the same problems as experience on your weapons. A lot of people like it because it makes options less overwhelming. They unlock abilities, or in Warframe, just like mod space, not all at once over time, which makes it easier to digest. Now, some people like me very understandably hate that very same thing that a lot of people love, because for me it's just like I'm only playing this to have the options. You making me wait for the options makes me have less fun with the game, not more. It just makes me consider not playing the game. It's not going to make me play the game for longer. If anything, it's going to make me play the game not at all, But of course, because it makes the playtime for the game longer, and most people are willing to just wait through the level up process to get the stuff. Most games do this. They have levels, but you'll notice in many games that it's completely pointless at the end of the day. You could just get rid of the leveling system and there would be very few things you need to change, and the game would be the same, if not better, and more respectful of your time. But there are some things that some types of players like about leveling up, or at least they think they like them. Who knows how they'd feel if those things were gone, but they're not going to be, and that's why. I do think it's worthy in a discussion about experience, the question why experience is there at all, because in many games, to a lesser or greater extent, it's pretty invisible and either blatantly serves to make the game longer or it's kind of a scaling mechanic, but it doesn't actually functionally make much of a difference. You know, it drives you to play in a way to keep up with the scaling, but if you just got rid of it, you would probably do that anyway. A good example of that is Genshin Impact, where enemies kind of just are around the level that you are. So technically their levels vary, but like they just are the level that your party is. So like, what's the point, you know? And again, the point is because RPG mechanic that makes the game longer, whatever. But some people do like that. I just think it's important to note in the same breath that there are other people that hate that and would definitely enjoy games more if it wasn't there or if you could bypass it. I will freely admit that in some games I've played that have leveling up systems, I modded or hacked the game to remove them so that I could, you know, spend my limited free time enjoying the build systems in the game without having to waste my time leveling them up if I deemed it to be a waste of time. And there are also other games where I think levels can be not a problem or even really a robust part of the game, like Dungeons and Dragons is a good example. There are a lot of storytelling opportunities if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons revolving around your character getting access to parts of their kit later. You know, a thing that I found really interesting quite a few times playing Dungeons and Dragons is where you'll take a subclass or your multi-class option at a key point in your character's level progression because it makes sense mechanically, but also because it represents your character kind of remembering or choosing or resorting to something. Or maybe even you unexpectedly multi-class because something comes up in the story. I'll give you a quick example since we're on this topic, but this is pretty far afield from your question, go figure. We're basically just talking about leveling mechanics in video games now, but I do think that's related. Affinity Range isn't even a discussion we have if leveling is itself pointless. And I do want to get back to that in Warframe as well, but just briefly, maybe you're a bard in Dungeons and Dragons. You cast your magic by playing an instrument or reading cards from the deck of the tarot, or by writing poetry and reading a haiku before an explosion happens over there. You perform art to evoke your magic. A variety of ways. And you're going about your bardly business, and you're adventuring, and you're in a dungeon, and you find the boss of the dungeon. And the boss of the dungeon ain't feeling too good about their odds against you and your grizzled party of adventurers. They really don't want to hear that guitar solo you're about to play for them. So they strike you a deal. They say, I'll give you some of my power if you let me, you know, stay alive. You have been offered the opportunity to become a warlock. Warlocks get their magic from a deal with the dark, with some kind of eldritch being. And maybe you, as an emergent storytelling option, you become a warlock multi-classed bard. And you take a couple of levels in warlock and stop being a bard for a little bit. Or you don't stop being a bard, but you stop progressing as a bard for a little bit. And this type of magic gets cast some other way with some warlocky thing. Or maybe your DM flavors it as you getting a sick, really metal looking guitar. And now your warlock spellcasting focus and your bard spellcasting focus are the same, but the type of music you play or the way the music is played is just kind of different depending on what you cast. Maybe the warlock magic, you put your hand there, you begin to strum, but the magic takes over and a solo from beyond comes out of your fingertips, whereas the bard stuff is you playing the music, maybe representing different musical styles, or maybe it's a little scary how you kind of can't stop playing when you're doing the warlock spells. This is just a random D&D concept, but you can see how there, leveling up your character is actually a really meaty mechanic or potentially an interesting storytelling idea, rather than something you just kind of have to do. Not for nothing, it's also pretty common for people to play campaigns where characters simply don't start at level 1, like for whatever reason. And that gets us back to Warframe. In Warframe, you play a Tenno, a member of a extra planar warrior caste that controls a Warframe as like a bodyguard for the rich elite of the old Orokin Empire. Why on earth do you need to level up anything or get experience using anything? You know, you could offer some kind of lore reason, and that's fine. Like, if you find that interesting, that's fine. But I just want to suggest, doesn't it feel like Warframe is a game where it doesn't even make sense in the first place that you would level stuff up? I guess it's like you getting used to the Warframe. Really, Forma is the most offensive mechanic here to me. Needing to, add more customization to your Warframe, your weapon, by leveling it up again, to me is the biggest thorn in my side. Leveling them up once to kind of get used to it, that vaguely makes sense. Even if you're an experienced warrior, some of the weapons in Warframe, it's like, what the hell do you do with this to kill people? Sure, I guess gaining experience with it makes some sense. And again, lore is not the be-all end-all, but I'm just saying, like, if that is considered to be partially a reason, it's a stupid reason, because customizing the weapon again, it doesn't really make that much sense that you have to level it up. It's done to make the game take longer to play. And I think that there's a thing here where mechanics around experience really exist as a way to keep players playing games longer, but I think it largely also gets them burnt out. And not the real solution, but a very good solution is to simply have the player play other games so they don't get burnt out, and they'll want to come back to your game lots of times. Focused play sessions will lead to their desires to spend money in your game to be focused in that play session where they're having fun and spending money and doing things that are meaningful. And they'll want to come back to that game because they will leave happy. There's this thing in marketing, in analytics, where people often react to, the pie graph. And so changes come too late. And this is how businesses always deteriorate, because they're always working on data, but it's like too abstracted, And if only they could think from the perspective of like a human who is doing the thing, the way to fix the game's issues, it becomes obvious if you just play the game and think about it like someone playing the game, rather than as a developer of the game that doesn't play it as much. That balance can be hard, of course. You might not have time. Or as a business person who isn't invested in the game. Again, bluntly, if your game's fate is determined by people who don't play or make it, your game is doomed, because those people cannot possibly make a sensible decision for the game. The only way this will work is if the game is simply not an ongoing game. You'll notice that games made by AAA studios with a ton of money are usually pretty good if that doesn't need to be considered. If it's a matter of making some cinematic storytelling work like God of War or something like that. And games that are made by a large studio that are live service ongoing games tend to eventually do very badly, because the people in charge of them will never steer them in the right direction. They'll always miss that. It's not a coincidence that games made those ways usually fall into those categories. It's because of the board of directors. It's because of the publisher. If they get to steer the ship will crash. And the only solution is to make it so the ship doesn't need to be steered, because the people with the money are going to be steering the ship. You simply keep it docked and let people walk onto it when it is not out at sea. This is your God of War. So, I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like my answer, Flipz, is that games that are ongoing games that are not made by a large number of people, beholden in some extent to a publisher, a board of directors, or just made by a lot of people and it's hard to unite them under one vision, are always going to have mechanics that just sort of don't make sense, because that's often how game development works, I would argue. This is just a suggested explanation, but I do think that if you look at games in the world, it is nearly always correct. Like, I'm not sure that my reasoning is why, but you'll note that it at least correlates nearly perfectly. The reason there's affinity range and experience in Warframe is because it is a large ongoing game, and virtually every game in that category will have thematically similar problems. I don't think there is any really compelling reason in Warframe mechanically that it is like a good game mechanic, so to say. As a quick closing thought, I want to note that we do have an item in Warframe, a couple items, the phosphors, those flares you can get from the Cetus. If you don't know about these, it's F-O-S-F-O-R. They're flares, they're gear items, and they increase your affinity range by a lot. They do stack with each other too. You can also pick Vozarin as your focus school to increase your affinity range. And if you do those things, it is quite challenging for allies to be outside of your affinity range, even in a survival mission. Those things don't cost very much, in theory. There's a little opportunity cost for the focus school, but so in a way, affinity range like isn't a mechanic, I suppose. But I don't know. I that isn't really an answer. I just thought it was worth noting. An interesting question that I hope I gave a satisfying answer to, given that I don't really know. I do think that experience itself is a largely long-term pointless mechanic in games like this. So why limit where you can get experience? I couldn't begin to understand, but that was my speculation and some thoughts.